On the one hand, I want to say that this topic is one that I have been thinking about and preparing for a long time. I've read several things about this subject. I think I have done some deeper thinking than I had in the past on this subject. And so on the one hand, I would love to stand before you and say, yes, I am prepared to talk about this. But on the other hand, I have this very real recognition of a shortcoming. And that is, I really don't know anything about suffering. There are people in this room right now who know depths of suffering that I don't know yet. Because whatever our experience has been thus far, all of us are going to suffer in significant ways in life. There are many different ways that we experience suffering. And we're going to talk about some of those in the class, but not much. I think all of us recognize that people can suffer in different ways. That suffering might take the form of a chronic illness. It might take the form of significant loss, financial loss, loss of a relationship, loss of a spouse or a dearly loved family member, a child perhaps. We may experience suffering at the hands of other people. People in this world have been persecuted severely for their values and their faith. I think we all have some understanding of the kinds of suffering that happen. And so I don't really think we need to spend a lot of time talking about that. But the big picture question that we're asking in this class is, can God work through suffering and redeem it? When we think about redemption, we think about salvation. God redeeming us, redeeming our souls, and bringing us back to Him through His Son. And of course, we should think about that. But God is able to be redemptive in other spheres. All of those things are related to what Christ did on the cross for our salvation. That's the ultimate unfolding of God's redemptive efforts. But God can redeem suffering and pain and loss, and He can make sense of those things through what He has done in Christ. And that's where we're going to eventually get to in the end of the quarter. The dictionary defines a wilderness as an empty or pathless area or region. And I said in your notes that I think sometimes life feels like a wilderness. These words, empty and pathless, are at times fitting descriptions for our lives. We go through a personal wilderness. People talk about going through a personal hell, and we know what they mean by that. Hell is a place of intense suffering, torment, and pain. And people use that language lightly, perhaps, but other times they don't. They really do feel that their experience is comparable. We may face challenges. We're going to have questions. We're going to be grasping for answers, trying to make sense of why is this happening to me? And this is not fair. Why is this event taking place? What can I do about this? How can I make this better? These kinds of questions we're going to ask. And oftentimes, those answers that we come up with are not all that helpful. And we understand that time is really the only thing that can heal all wounds. But man, the time sure does go slow when you're in that wilderness. So in your questions, the very first one, I want us to warm up a little bit together. What descriptive words come to your mind when you think of a wilderness? What terms do you think about? Don't cheat and use the 2 on the screen. Danger. How so?
Likelihood of being harmed somehow.
Okay. The Bible talks about beasts, wild beasts from the wilderness. That's a real danger. What other dangers may exist in the wilderness? Isolation. Good.
Loneliness.
All right. Good. Loneliness. What other words come to mind when you think about the wilderness?
Thirst.
Uninhabited. Okay.
Thirst.
Yeah. We're talking about a desert, right? There's no water. What else is there not very much of? And you can think about the Israelites' experience if you'd like to do that. Food. All right. We're hungry out here. This picture, I don't know where this location is, but this is indeed a picture of a wilderness. And so when the Israelites went out into the wilderness, it looked a lot like this. They were not going to an oasis. So we think about terms like desolate, barren, void of life. Okay, these are the kinds of things that we associate with a wilderness. And the overarching idea that I want to convey this quarter is that life on earth, figuratively speaking, is a wilderness. And the wilderness is going to bring us pain and suffering and loss. But we'll understand all by and by. That's what we sang, right? Tempted and tried, wilderness. We are oft made to wonder. Why? Why is this happening? What can I do about this? What can I do to make this better? I think somebody's trying to chime in and answer my questions. We're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long. I used to criticize that song because I thought it was really disrespectful on our part to say some of those words in the song. Think about some of the words. We sing about other people who are living so wicked year after year, and yet they're prospering. And the implication is, I'm not prospering, right? Here I am trying to serve God, and I've got this miserable existence, and then here's all these wicked people out here whom God is blessing and prospering, and they're terrible. And I used to think, man, it's really bad that we come into the presence of God as, 21st century Americans, and we drove here in our nice cars with heated seats or air conditioning, and then we've got all these nice luxuries at home, and then we come in here and we talk about how miserable we are. But it dawned on me later that I don't have to personally share the sentiments and the experiences of the author of the song in order to agree with what's being said. That suffering and not prospering while the wicked do prosper, maybe that was true for the author. It may not be true for me, but that doesn't mean I can't sing the song, because one day it might be true for me, right? I don't have to personally be able to identify with the writer's thoughts and words in order to faithfully sing the song. So maybe I've matured a little bit in my understanding of some of those things, maybe not. But life is a wilderness. At the very least, it is at times a wilderness. For some of us, it's a wilderness every day. And there's dangers lurking all the time. And there's pain and there's hardship all the time. For others, it may just be a seasonal wilderness. We'll come through it, maybe in short order. But while we're in there, we're going to struggle. It's going to be tough. Yes?
I'm
somebody used another term. You started
Uh-huh.
asking that.
Yes.
It's a term that may or may not be related to the wilderness. I don't know. I didn't research the word, but I think of the word bewilderment.
Yes.
And often that is the case.
Yeah, bewilderment. Yeah, that's good. Surely those are etymologically related, wouldn't you think? Seems to be. All right, so let's open our Bibles to Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20. And if you had your material before tonight and you read through it, I'm not going to read through what's in your material. Even if you haven't done it, you can go back and do that on your own. But I do want to point out some ideas that relate to where we're going this quarter as we think about Israel's history in the wilderness. Now, just as a little bit of a review and a reminder, where is the prophet Ezekiel when God speaks to him and gives him his prophetic messages? He's in Babylon. That's right. Thank you, Joe. He's in Babylon. All right. He's in captivity. So he is far removed from his homeland. And chapter 20 is a review of Israel's history. And it's almost like God is saying to Ezekiel, let me tell you how your people have come to this point. I asked you in your lesson to go through and note how many times the word wilderness is used in the chapter. But the first thing I want you to see is that God brought Israel out of bondage in Egypt, and the text says he led them into the wilderness. Look at chapter 20, in verse 5. On the day when I chose Israel and swore to the descendants of the house of Jacob and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, when I swore to them, saying, I am the Lord your God, on that day I swore to them to bring them out from the land of Egypt into a land I had selected for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. Does God have something really great and awesome in store for the nation of Israel? The glory of all the lands on the earth. I mean, this sounds incredible. And so he gives some instruction in verse 7, cast away your idols. I am the Lord your God. Verse 8 says the people rebelled against him and they were not willing to do that. But he decides to save them anyways, to bring them out of Egypt. And look in verse 10. I took them out of the land of Egypt and I brought them into that. This is where he brought them. Glory of all lands, right? Hey, God, listen, we had things pretty good back in Egypt. You mean you brought us out of there to come out here? Why? Now, understand, when he says, I brought them out into the wilderness, he's not yet talking about their 40-year punishment of having to wander. That comes a little bit later in Ezekiel 20. He's not there yet. Geographically speaking, though, once you come out of Egypt, what do you walk into? This. You come into wilderness. But God has something wonderful in store for them on the other side. I want you to hold that thought. Here's the second thing I want us to see from this text. God gave them everything that they needed to have both physical and spiritual life. He talks about several things in the chapter. Spiritually, in verse 11, he says, I gave them my statutes and I informed them of my ordinances. In other words, I gave them my laws. He did that at Mount Sinai, which looks a lot like that. He gave them his laws, his expectations for them. Verse 12 says he gave them his Sabbaths. That would be something that sanctifies them, something that sets them apart from other nations, something that they could enjoy and find rest, not just rest from their work, but rest in God himself. We know from other passages, God gave them food, he gave them water, he made it so that the shoes on their feet didn't wear out. that the clothes that they were wearing lasted forever. God gave them everything that they need to have life as they make their trek through the wilderness. But Ezekiel chapter 20 says again and again that the people rebelled against God. They fought back. They resisted all of these things that he was trying to do for them. And I love the language that comes in verse 33, where God says, "As I live, surely with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out, I will be king over you. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you are scattered with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out. And I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there I will enter into judgment with you face to face." A little bit later in the chapter, he talks about verses 40 and following, bringing a remnant of faithful people back. People not under his judgment anymore, but now people whom he has blessed. But I love this language of verse 33. It's basically, to paraphrase, God saying, one way or another, I am going to be your king. You're going to acknowledge me one way or another. Whether you like it or not, you're going to bow your knee before me, because God wants to be a benevolent king. He wants to bless them richly. And yet they keep fighting back. They keep resisting. I want you to notice something that I had never noticed until I had been preparing this lesson several weeks ago. Look back earlier in the chapter when he tells them in verse 7 to cast away their idols. Then verse 8, they did not cast away their idols. Verse 8 says, "Then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them to accomplish my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt." God says, I was ready to strike all of you dead even while you were in Egypt, before I brought you out. That's how obstinate and rebellious these people had been. Even before he rescued them, he says, I was ready to do this, but I chose not to. Wayne?
Verse 16 says they were devoted to their idols.
Yes, very good. What I want to show you in this, and if you haven't done it, go through the chapter later and just underline every time the word wilderness shows up. And what I want you to see in this is that God is working with his people, loving his people, showing his grace and his goodness to his people, even in the wilderness. Even when things are at their absolute worst. I mean, can you imagine a worse place to live than that? And yet, every time, God is there with them. And he is helping them. And we're going to have some more to say about this in future lessons. But think about these things these difficult things, these bad things the Israelites would have experienced while they're in the wilderness. No food, no water, glaring heat, cold in the evenings, impatience, fond remembrances of Egypt. Man, Moses, you brought us all the way out here. I mean, at least back there we had a place to live. We had some food. But you brought us out here to die. Lack of trust, isolation, all these things that we've talked about already. This was their experience. And yet God is leading them through the entire time. Now think about these things that are on the screen. God brought them out of bondage, and he brought them into the wilderness. Isn't that true for us? God has brought you and me out of bondage, and yet here we are experiencing life in a wilderness. Look around. How much sadness and negativity and heartbreak is in the world? Look at the things that you see on the news. By the way, lesson number 2, that's your homework. Question 1, watch the news. Take you 5 minutes to do question number 1. We don't have to go very far. We don't have to look very long to see that life on this earth can be miserable. And suffering is a huge part of that. You think people in the Ukraine feel like they're in a wilderness right now? As they're watching their world get destroyed, as they're losing their loved ones? You think life for them feels empty and pathless and desolate right now? Why is God letting this happen? Why doesn't God put a stop to this? You think there are people asking those kinds of questions right now? Why doesn't God just strike Putin while he's asleep and not let him wake up in the morning? These are the kinds of things that we ask. These are the issues we struggle with. God saved me from my sin, and yet not everything in life is just great. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of heartache. But you know, God has given us everything that we need, both physically and spiritually, to have life, hasn't he? There's nothing that we lack, physically or spiritually. Now, there may be times where we're eating a little bit leaner than we were in the past, but we have what we need. There may be times when our clothes are wearing out and we don't quite have enough money in the bank to get some new ones just yet, but we have what we need. And spiritually speaking, we don't lack a single thing, do we? God's provided for us. Because God is our benevolent king. The best kind of government to ever exist is a benevolent dictatorship. The problem is, it's never existed on earth. I know it's the best kind of government because it's God's government. It's what he is. He's a benevolent dictator. Such as never existed on earth. But he does exist in heaven. So as we go through this wilderness of life, we're going to face temptations just like Israel did. We're going to face difficulty and hardship just like Israel did. And New Testament writers understood this. New Testament writers made this connection. They said, listen, Christians, Israel's experience in the wilderness is just like ours. And you see this in two places. The first one is in Hebrews chapter 3. The Hebrew writer, whoever he may have been, he makes this very connection. He talks about Israel in the wilderness, and then he turns his attention to the Christians to whom he is writing. And he says, you're in the same place that they were, but don't do what they did. While the Israelites were literally in the wilderness as they were journeying to the glory of all lands, Christians are in a figurative wilderness. The Israelites were led out by Moses. They had to wander for 40 years. Many of them. In fact, almost all of them died in the wilderness. That original generation that came out of Egypt, how many of them made it into the land of Canaan? 2. That's it. Those 20 and older who came out of Egypt, only 2 of them made it in. But the recipients of this letter, they're going through a personal wilderness. And they are in danger of turning away from Christ in the same way that Old Testament Israel turned away from God. And the writer says, don't do it. So it's question number 4, right? You know, I spent many, many hours on this material combing through it to make sure there were no typos, and there was a typo in the first lesson. Did you notice, I think there's 2 question 4s and 2 question 5s? Yeah, I'm sorry. All right. Question number 4. What warnings do you see in these verses, beginning in Hebrews 3 and verse 12 and going through chapter 4 and verse 2? What warnings do you see?
Beware of unbelieving hearts.
Don't have an evil, unbelieving heart, he says in chapter 3 and verse 12. What else? God has been and can be provoked. Don't test him, he says, as your fathers did. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, they were putting God to the test. They were tempting God. Well, if you really are God, then why don't you do this for us so that we'll really know that you are who you say you are, and that kind of a thing. They're putting him to the test. You see any other warnings? Good. All right. Verse 13. Do not be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Any other ones?
They were chosen, but they were also rejected.
Okay, good. And I want to come back to that because Paul's going to say the same thing in 1 Corinthians 10. They were chosen, but at the same time, they were also rejected. Chapter 4, verse 1 has another one. Don't fall short of his rest. Don't come short of the rest that God has in store for you. The implication with all of this is that Israel did not heed the warnings. And that's why God laid them waste in the desert. Could you imagine coming out of the land of Egypt into a place that looks like this, and then when the 12 spies go into the land, they come back, and only 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, say, let's go, sharpen your swords, it's time to go fight. Everybody listens to the 10 spies, and they receive their punishment to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Can you imagine how many bodies there were strewn out across the desert? If you were one of those people ages 20 and below, what kind of impact do you think that would have had on you? Constantly hearing the thud of a body fall to the ground, dropping like flies, north of 1 million Israelites, and they're all dying. If I'm an Israelite teenager, I'm going to notice that. And I'm going to say, you know what? Whatever they did, I don't want to do that. I want to keep walking. I don't want to have the same experience that they did. But what encouragements and admonitions do you see in this text? Exhort one another, verse 13 says. Encourage each other. What else? All right. What else? The promise is still there. Yeah, the promise of entering God's rest is still there. How about verse 14? You've become a partaker of Christ. Don't relinquish that. Don't give up on that. All right, let's quickly go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul is going to say a lot of the same things here, although he uses different language. And here's where the typo in your material is found. This should be question number 6, not the second number 4. What parallels between Israel and Christians does Paul mention in the first 4 verses? Israel was baptized. Yep. They were baptized. What else had they received and enjoyed? Spiritual food, spiritual drink. All right? The Israelites were a blessed people. But the point that Paul is making here to the Christians in Corinth, and there's a broader context here of chapters 8, 9, and 10 that all work together. But the problem in Corinth was that their pride was overcoming them. They thought that they were perhaps more important than they really were. Well, you know, we're God's chosen people. We're Christians. We're followers of Christ. We've got everything laid out for us. And Paul says, well, yeah, that's true, but you know what? Israel was baptized too. Israel had a spiritual meal too. They received bread that came down from heaven every day. God fed them just like He's given you. You're enjoying the same things that they did, but what happened to them? For the most part, they died. And so to go back to my dad's point earlier, Israel was chosen, but they were also rejected. And Paul says to the Christians in Corinth, yes, you've been chosen, but that doesn't mean your job is finished. That doesn't mean God is done with you yet. He might still reject you if you don't turn some things around. Alan?
And they drank of the spiritual rock that was Christ.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's always been an interesting passage to me in verse 4, where they were drinking from the spiritual rock which followed them. I've never seen a rock that could follow somebody. but from this rock came water, and Paul says that that rock was Christ. Israel knew Christ too. Maybe not in the same way that the Corinthians did, but they had God on their side too. He chose them, but he also rejected them. So the last question in your material, Paul says we should learn from Israel's poor example in verses 6 and 11. But what things did they do that we should not do as we journey through our wilderness? What things does he say they did? They craved evil things. What else? They worshiped idols. They complained. They grumbled. What else? Sexual immorality. Verse 9 says they put God to the test. I want you to think about a couple of these ideas as we go through our wilderness. When we face hardship, you think we're ever going to do any complaining and grumbling about that? You think we might even try to test God? You know, God, if you really loved me, you wouldn't let me face this. You know, God, if you really cared about me, you'd do something about my pain. These are the places we go when we suffer. We have to learn to develop a wilderness mentality. And that's the second part of the material, titled The People of the Wilderness. What kinds of people must we be as we go through the wilderness? But in our first section, we're going to spend 3 more lessons really talking about how life here is truly a wilderness. How we have a lot of unanswered questions, how we have difficulties that we can't seem to wrap our minds around. And I just want to give you a little bit more information about next class. So if you have your material, look at page 8, the beginning of lesson 2. Question number 1, and you can start doing this even tonight, but this is not something you'll be able to do, Wednesday on the way to services. Watch the news, search the web, list 3 headlines or stories that you find that display the sad state of humanity. And I'm not looking for stories that, hey, little Johnny lost his dog. I mean, that's bad, but I'm talking serious stuff. And I'd be curious to know, how long does it take you to find 3 stories? I bet it doesn't take you very long. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.